some people have more of it than others, and the researchers who design IT argue that they can assess to what extent you as an individual show implicit racism or sexism or ageism using their test. And if you take it, it will actually give you a score and will tell you your level of implicit racism. Now, they believe that that's a good intervention to get people to sort of think about their own level of implicit racism or sexism. Other psychologists argue that the fact that your reaction times differ for these different kinds of word pairs may be very interesting, but may not be a good measure of implicit racism or sexism or anything else. So it's quite controversial. But if you go on the implicit website, you'll see that you'll probably be the 10 millionth person who's completed one, so it's very widely used throughout the world. Very controversial. I think Danielle will talk more about this in the discussion, but there's a lot of research on this right now because people are interested in how can we assess the ways in which stereotype and prejudice work on an unconscious level. And again, the thinking is that even though we live in a society where people constantly control their stereotype and prejudice, we still see the effects of stereotype and prejudice, so they must be working on a more unconscious level, and researchers want to get at that, but no surprise, it's difficult to do psychological research on unconscious processes. So this just gives you a flavor for this kind of research. It's very, very, very active area of research, very controversial. It's on the one hand, it's very compelling. Like, it seems to make sense. Like, of course, if there are stereotypes in our culture, even though we might not explicitly subscribe to them and not believe them, they still could exert an influence on our behavior on a more unconscious level. In a sense, that's a sort of compelling argument. On the other hand, how in the world can we measure it? And is it the right way, or is priming the right way? Yes, we can see differences between groups depending on whether some words are primed or not. But what does that mean? So it's a very controversial area of research, but one that's quite active. Any questions about that? But I do encourage you to go to Project Implicit, maybe not between now and the exam, but when you have some free time, I'd like to know how prejudiced you are. And again, I think that the researchers would argue they wouldn't make it public if they didn't believe that having an understanding of your own level of implicit prejudice is actually good in helping you to figure out how to reduce it. Because they would argue, and again this is debatable, that being aware of your own level of implicit prejudice is one critical step in terms of figuring out how to reduce it. So this leads us finally to the last topic in our discussion of prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination. Social psychologists have done a lot of work to identify all the ways that social and cognitive processes lead us to have prejudice, lead us to develop and maintain stereotypes. So what next? Is there anything that social psychologists can offer, not just to help us understand why these things exist, but instead to help us figure out what can be done about them? What can we do to reduce prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination? If we believe that through, for example, self-fulfilling prophecy effects, stereotype threat effects, that the existence of stereotypes and prejudice themselves lead to negative outcomes on the stereotype groups, then there will be good societal reasons to want to address the origin of the stereotypes and prejudice and figure out ways of reducing them in the hopes of eliminating disparities between groups on the societal level. So social psychologists have a long history of trying to harness the basic research on prejudice into interventions that could reduce prejudice and discrimination. And the history of these efforts has been at best mixed, but there is a little bit of encouraging evidence from very recent research. But let's start with the stuff that did not work so well. The first main idea that social psychologists had to reduce stereotypes and prejudice was contact, and there was, in the literature for many years, a thing known as the contact hypothesis. The basic idea of the contact hypothesis is that the more contact that members of different groups have, the better their understanding will be of each other, and the more prejudice and stereotypes will be reduced. The premise is sort of a naive but still compelling premise that, you know, if you have a stereotype, maybe you just haven't encountered somebody who defies that stereotype. So if you have contact between groups, you may meet individuals who defy the stereotype you have with that other group, and that should reduce your stereotypes and prejudice. Now, this was popular, not surprisingly, before there was all this cognitive research suggesting mental biases that lead us to maintain stereotypes. So this was before that. So it made sense to try contact, to try to get groups to interact with each other. And, in a sense, the idea of the contact hypothesis was one of, not the only, but one of the main rationales for there being massive societal desegregation of schools, for example. And the idea that desegregating schools would reduce stereotypes and thereby improve the academic performance as well as the self-esteem of minority kids. However, there's been a lot of social psychological research, primarily meta-analysis, where people aggregate results of individual studies, that has shown, both in laboratory settings as well as using naturalistic data from school systems, for example, that contact may have very important societal implications. Like, it may be that society-wide we need groups to interact with each other so that they're aware of each other and they know each other to some degree, know how to interact with each other. But the idea that mere contact would reduce prejudice and reduce discrimination and reduce stereotyping and reduce the self-esteem of minority groups, that has turned out not to, there basically is not strong evidence for that. Despite the many important positive outcomes that have come from desegregation and the societal importance of having groups interact, when we look at the behavioral impact, contact alone does not seem to reduce prejudice and stereotypes. Again, it has important outcomes like getting groups to know how to interact with each other. But that in and of itself does not seem to reduce prejudice and discrimination, nor does it improve performance of stereotyped groups, nor does it increase self-esteem of underrepresented groups. And it's just like, in Robbers Cave, where just having the kids go to the dining hall together led to food fights. Just bringing groups of people that don't like each other together does not automatically, in and of itself, reduce the prejudice and eliminate any negative effects of that prejudice on the targeted group. So the failure of contact to show clear effects in reduction of prejudice and stereotypes has led psychologists to look for different kinds of interventions. An outgrowth of contact that has turned out to be more promising has been work on what's called the jigsaw classroom. This work by a psychologist named Aronson. What Aronson argued is contact is not enough because when you take groups of individuals, one of whom has relatively more power and status than the other, and you put them in contact with each other, the problem is that, yeah, you have them in contact, but the power and status differential only becomes more pronounced once the groups are interacting with each other. In that sense, contact could exacerbate the effects of the status difference because you're making it more salient. You're putting the high power and low power groups together, saying interact with each other, and what happens? The low power group realizes what low power they have and what low status they have, and that makes them feel even worse. So what Aronson argued is that for contact between groups to have an effect, you have to deal with this power and status differential. Because if you don't, then you're just going to exacerbate the problem by having the groups come together.